Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Plastic Podcast, the show that tells the science and the story of our relationship with plastic. I am your host, Clark Marchese, and today we are traveling to Thailand and Malaysia to talk about the global economy of plastic waste. Before we jump into it, we always get started with a trivia question. So for today, the question is, which of the following is the most abundant element in the universe? Is it A, hydrogen, B, helium, C, iron, or D, mercury? Your hint is to think of the gas giants. And that's all I'm going to say. Okay, Spotify listeners can answer directly on the episode page of the app, and everyone else can DM me on Instagram at Pine Forest Media for a chance to win a monthly prize. And no cheating, okay? Stick around to the end of the credits to hear the answer to last week's question and to hear a lovely review from Apple Podcasts from one of you. Okay, the global economy of plastic waste. What is it? Well, it's about a $37 billion industry. And that number is so high because us humans produce so much waste, and we've just got to figure out what to do with it. Now, this term, global economy of plastic waste, refers largely to the international imports and exports of plastic waste. Why would countries want to import and export plastic waste? Well, we're about to find out. We're also going to find out why these countries that produce and consume the most plastic waste around the world are not the same that are, quote, the highest contributors to plastic pollution. What I will tell you now is that there is a directional flow of plastic waste from high-income Western countries to low-income countries in the global South, or the majority world as we sometimes call it. In the next 25 minutes or so, we are going to investigate the cause of this directional flow, the social and ecological consequences that it brings, and also what has already been done and what is going to be done to address it. To help guide us through all of this, I have two guests for us today. The first is Dr. Hui Ling, a researcher turned sustainability consultant from Malaysia, and Dr. Danny Marks, who is a researcher at the Dublin City University in Ireland and specializes in the social implications of environmental issues. And without further ado, let's get started. All right, well, first of all, hello, welcome to the show. Let me start by asking each of you to introduce yourselves.
Sure. My name is Dr. Danny Marks. I'm assistant professor at environmental politics and policy at Dublin City University in Ireland. My interest is in Southeast Asia, particularly Thailand, but I also done research in Cambodia, Vietnam, and Laos as well. They're looking at basically environmental change and risks and looking at how they affect people and also non-people like animals, particularly in terms of justice, why some groups are affected the most. So I've looked at a host of issues directly related to this podcast. I've looked at plastic. I guess I became interested in Southeast Asia because I'm mixed. My mother is Thai. My father is American. I grew up in the U.S., but I was born in Thailand. And after I went to university in the U.S., I spent many years in Southeast Asia. And I guess I grew an affinity to the region and became interested in environmental issues there.
All right, lovely to meet you. Thank you for being here.
Right. So I'm Hui Ling. You can also call me Chen. My research background is basically on microplastics in Malaysian rivers, but I've also done some research on the plastic waste problem in Malaysia and also some research on household waste separation in Malaysia. Currently, I'm no longer doing research and I've ventured into sustainability consulting.
All right, I'm so glad to have both of you here. And both of you have interaction with a region that is talked about a lot when we think of the global plastic waste economy. And I think it's because there is quite an imbalance going on. According to Our World in Data, 81% of marine plastic waste comes from Asia, which obviously Asia is so enormous that statistic is almost not even helpful. But if we break it down by country, we see high numbers from Indonesia, the Philippines, and yes, Malaysia and Thailand as well. And the reason that this is an imbalance is because if you look at other statistics, such as plastic production, only one country in Southeast Asia even makes it onto the top 10, which just so happens to be Indonesia. So we see a major disconnect in production and pollution. But beyond that, we see a major disconnect in waste generation and pollution, which you would think would be sort of the same. But the country with the highest plastic waste generation is by far the United States, and then the EU as a whole comes third on the list. So how does it happen that the West is producing all of this waste, but most of our plastic marine pollution is coming out of Southeast Asia?
It's a good question about why this imbalance occurs. I would point to two reasons. First is in terms of imports. These countries, particularly after 2017, when China implemented its national sword policy, which basically means China is going to stop taking imports from Western countries, they became the global dumping site of the world in terms of plastic. They struggled basically to handle all this additional plastic from these Western countries. And so that means that even though these Western countries might use a lot, they basically export it, so they don't have to deal. And so instead, a lot of it ends up in Southeast Asia. I think one statistic ends up 75% of global exported waste ends up in Asia. So for example, the UK exports about 70% of its waste. So that's one piece of the puzzle. The other piece of the puzzle is that these countries have very poor waste management systems. One statistic of Thailand is that 27% of its waste is improperly disposed, which basically means leaks into the environment. They don't have good landfill sites. There's a lot of littering, dumping, a lot of waste leaks basically into waterways. These waste management systems are not properly funded in these countries. They don't have good resources, particularly at local municipal level. And then I think a third part of the puzzle is the geography of these countries, particularly island countries. If you have more coastline, it's just a higher risk for plastic to seep into the ocean. So some countries like Philippines and Indonesia, that hundreds of thousands of islands. And so this makes it just more easy for plastic to get into the oceans from these countries.
Okay, so there's two things I want to bring up from that. The first has to do with the figure of 27% of waste in Thailand being mismanaged. And I just want to connect that to 70% of waste from the United Kingdom being exported. And I just wonder if that 70% would fall into the properly managed category or improperly managed. Just something to think about. Second, I looked up the countries with the most kilometers of coastline, and Canada is number 1, Norway is number 2, and the United States is number 8, and the United Kingdom is number 12. Malaysia doesn't show up until we get all the way down to 29, and Thailand at 35. So I point this out because it could be easy for us to say, well, Southeast Asian countries have a lot of islands and coastline. Of course they have a lot of marine plastic pollution. That's just the way the cookie crumbles. No, that's how we smash the cookie. There are international capitalist pressures that cause a pollution imbalance, and the long coastlines of these countries only explain why that plastic ultimately reaches the ocean rather than staying landlocked. But let's take a look at those first two reasons, the imports and exports, as well as domestic management. Let's start with one. Can you give us a bit of an understanding about the global economy of plastic waste? How does it work?
So the global economy of plastic is basically just talking about the international trade of plastics between countries. So basically we have developed countries that often export their plastic waste to less developed countries because processing them is cheaper, and regulations related to these plastic wastes are less strict. So this essentially creates like a global market for plastic waste.
Max Liberowen wrote this book, The Waste is Colonialism. So that's what some people, I guess more critical academics have called this, is basically, it's continuation of old colonial practices, basically finding space and land to handle waste. And not only do the Western countries not have to take in the environmental impacts of producing the goods that they use, they also don't have to deal with the waste after they use the goods. Basically, all they have to do is consume it. And then they don't have to handle any of the adverse impacts. But yeah, some people could say waste is another form of colonialism. But certainly it's a transboundary failure because there's no global treaty that's specifically strong enough to deal with plastic waste. There are various treaties like the Basel Treaty and others, but they don't specifically target plastic waste. And so they basically failed.
So the Basel Treaty, or the Basel Convention, took place in 1989, and it was aimed at regulating the international movement of many types of hazardous waste, plastic being only one. It is considered the main and most important treaty to date regulating the movement of plastic waste, and it went into effect in 1992. There have been some noteworthy amendments to the treaty since then, but this was 30 years ago. So it's definitely a good thing that we have ongoing negotiations for another treaty on plastics, which listeners of the show will have heard of by now, and newcomers can go back to previous episodes to learn more about it. Now, this treaty, the Basel Treaty, I'll also say that the United States has signed but not ratified the treaty. So a little bit of nerdy nuance there. To sign a treaty means that you agree with the idea of it and its objectives. To ratify a treaty means to actually take it up as law. So the U.S. cannot be held liable for violating it because it has not yet been ratified. So to the old US of A, hi, hello, you're the problem, it's you. Anyways, one of the main tenets of this treaty is that sending countries must receive the prior and informed consent of the receiving countries before the trade can take place. Which leads me to my next question, which is why are countries, which you have just stated already have under-resourced waste management systems, giving their consent to receive all of this extra waste?
So Malaysia, before the global influx of plastic, we have already been importing plastics because this was to feed to our local plastic recycling industry, because locally we do not have enough plastic waste to be processed. That's why we import them.
Okay, so in some cases they are finding another use for it, sort of using sorted recycled waste as raw material for other products.
So for example, Thailand has a big company called Indorama, one of the biggest plastic producer in the country. I think 1 out of every 5 PET bottles are made by Indorama. So I talked to them and they said the problem is there's not very good waste separation in Thailand. So they can't even get good high quality plastic. And so basically they want to import plastic, because this plastic, it's separated. So it's quote recycled in these Western countries. And so it's easier for them then to process this recycled waste.
Okay, so if the waste was clean, recycled, properly sorted, to a certain extent, to a certain quantity, it could be useful to the receiving countries. But it seems like we're sending not only a mixed bag of garbage, but also more than is helpful. I was also reading before this, which it seems counterintuitive to a general understanding of trade, wherein one country pays another for a good. But in this case, do I understand that the receiving countries get paid to take the good, which in this case is plastic waste?
Yes, you're correct.
Basically, it's just a financial incentive. These countries say, we're going to pay you to handle the waste. And these countries don't necessarily know what they're going to do with it, but they say, hey, we want your money because we're relatively poor. And so then they take the waste.
Okay, I have another question then. Why are the countries that do have the resources for well-maintained waste management systems not just managing their own waste?
They don't have the infrastructure, the facilities to recycle all the waste. For example, in the U.S., they dismantled a lot of that. When I grew up in the U.S., there were recycling centers in my hometown. That's no longer there. They decided to ship it. And now if they wanted to reverse course, it'd be very expensive. They'd have to invest in a lot of infrastructure and facilities to be able to start recycling at a scale that would make an impact. For example, Ireland, where I am right now, 97% of quote recycled waste is exported. So it's a large amount.
Okay, so the U.S. really said, this is not our problem anymore, and divested from their own systems. And perhaps they never had systems large enough to cope with the amount of waste that Americans produce. But in any case, this is leading me to my next question, which is what happens when the waste arrives? I'm assuming not all of it is able to be recycled.
So when the plastic wastes are being imported, right, not all of them are regulated. So in Malaysia, there is this illegal plastic waste factories. There's these factories that they just import plastic waste just for the incentives. They're just collecting these plastic waste and not really processing them. And the quality of the waste are so bad that it's not even recyclable in the first place.
All right, so not all of this waste is high quality. And I'm sure, as we spoke of a bit earlier, a lot of it gets leaked into the environment as well. And I want to explore what sorts of local consequences that this is causing. And we're going to do that right after this very short break.
Hello, my name is Elena Berg. I'm a professor, an environmental scientist, and a water sommelier. I'm also the host of a new podcast called Something in the Water. Talking to water scientists, water farmers, and water sommeliers around the world, we take a deep dive into the world of fine waters, access to drinking water, and the complex relationship between sustainability and the water industry. You can listen wherever you're hearing this now. Stay hydrated and drink it up.
Okay, so before that short break, we were just about to get into some of the local challenges in Thailand and Malaysia that are being caused by the global economy of plastic waste. What can you tell me about them?
I think the challenges, the two main ones, right? It's environment and also social impacts. Of course, environment, you dump it in landfills, it's going to get affected. But also socially, we have a town called Junjarom. So it used to be this really nice, quiet town. But due to the illegal dumping of waste, right, it's now known as the plastic dumpster of Malaysia. And I think there's like more than 15,000 tons of waste that are dumped in this small town itself. So these factories, because they are illegal, they are not capable of recycling waste, right? So they just burn all the waste that they collect there. So this has also affected all of the people living in that town. And up till now, there are still reports of health problems of people that are living there. So my research in rivers is basically looking at microplastics, the sources of it, how they enter rivers, and also how it is related to river flows. We did a small study in Junjarom, which is the town I mentioned, to just sort of find out how much more plastics there are, and the results are really staggering. It's so much more polluted in Junjarom. It's just a small stretch of the river, but the plastics are way more than the main stem.
Right. We've covered plastic and the environment a bit on the show, and so we're not going to go into it now, but I will remind us what we learned from Abby Barrows in episode 2 about microplastics in the sea, traveling all over the world. And I'll also mention that Malaysia has a lot of coral reefs, which make it a biodiversity hotspot. And plastic is adding a big stress there. So this is to say that these environmental issues are not only localized, but they are going to impact the entire world. Now, that's also not to say that the localized impacts are not enough for us to address this issue, but just throwing that out there. I will also remind us of last week's episode when Dr. Badita Sibu mentioned the understudied health impacts of plastic waste in vulnerable populations in the global south. Well, this is definitely one example, and it just shows how severe the exposure risk can be. Dr. Marks, you also wrote a paper about the social implications of plastic waste management in Thailand, and one of the social risks you write is on account of the fact that unlike in the US or the EU, the Thai system relies more heavily on informal actors. Can you explain first what informal actors could look like, and then second, what are the added risks involved there?
Sure, that's a good question. So one reason for so many informal actors is that municipal governments, which are responsible for waste management, they do not impose people to separate waste. You go to a trash can in Thailand and everything's mixed together. And so this is where the informal economy comes in. These are people called seleng, are basically informal waste pickers. And so basically they collect, sort, and then transpose recycled materials. So they play a very vital function. I think one estimate says that they're worth about $16 million annually to the Bangkok economy, just Bangkok alone.
Are they paid by the government to do that?
Yeah, so basically it's like a subsidy almost. And so basically these people earn their livelihoods through picking waste. And so what they will do, some of them will drive around along with motorbikes or these little carts. They will stop and pick up plastic bottles or anything that they can make a little bit of money from. And so they segregate the waste, then they sell it to these bigger middlemen who will then sell it to these companies like Indorama. So that's one thing they do. They also, some of them go to land dumps. There they will, if it's not too difficult, they will also pick up waste from the landfills as well. So there's estimated 1.5 million in Thailand of these people. I mean, they're in Philippines as well, Indonesia, India. They're throughout the global south or developing countries. One problem is they're informal. They're not formalized. So they don't receive any benefits. They don't receive any welfare or any protection in terms of insurance from the state. Thailand less so than places like Philippines, where you actually have landfill explosions, where there's so much, basically this dangerous gas explodes and people have died from it. There's a lot of hazardous chemicals and it's bad for lungs, breathing in some of the materials when you're going through the waste. So yes, there's certainly a lot of issues.
Is there any effort to formalize these waste pickers?
There are some kind of NGOs that are working on it, but they haven't really gotten any traction at all, unfortunately. In other countries, there's been more movement than in Thailand.
I know that both Thailand and Malaysia are taking steps to address these challenges, both within their own countries and through their interaction with the sending countries. Can we talk about some of these strategies?
I mean, there has been talk about EPR law, extended producer responsibility law, but that hasn't come into force yet.
What would that look like for someone who doesn't know what an EPR is?
Basically, it means that those who produce the packaging are responsible for the complete life cycle of the product, not just its consumption, but also its waste. Companies could, for example, would invest in infrastructure for recycling, or they would pay more to help fund recycling initiatives. But basically, Thai companies have been fighting off against these EPR, particularly the big companies, because that basically means more costs for them. And the government has always been quite close to these big corporations. I mean, just to think of economics, who has to pay for the waste? Shouldn't those who profit from these goods have to pay for it? Plastic producers try to basically put the onus on anybody but themselves. And they argue that plastic is good. They'd say that plastic is good for the economy, plastic is good for human development, and that alternatives like paper or bamboo, they're bad for the environment as well. They basically say instead of reducing plastic, we just need to reuse and recycle more plastic.
What about in Malaysia?
So in 2020, we had a new minister. The ministry name is pretty long. It's something like Ministry of Energy, Science, Technology, Environment, and Climate Change. So it's a long ministry. So this minister, she took over and decided to send back all of the waste because it's not really compliant.
Okay, sort of similar to what China did, which was basically saying we're not going to accept it anymore, or at least as much anymore. I also read that Thailand is going to put an end to plastic imports soon. We're actually in the middle of a phase-out process that started in 2020, and the goal is to completely stop imports by 2025. So Western countries are going to start having to make some changes very soon. I'm curious, do either of you know if imports and exports are going to be addressed in the upcoming treaty on plastic pollution that we talk about so much on the show?
Oh, what's being discussed? There is talk about import and export, yeah.
If you could design a policy to regulate the imports and exports of waste entering the region of Southeast Asia, what would it say?
Generally, to enforce stricter regulations. Because, like I mentioned just now, right, it's all illegal. And some of the waste are even labeled as something else. So that means nobody really knows what's inside the container. They just accept it, but then it's all plastic waste inside. So definitely stricter regulations are needed. But I think like internationally, of course, I think the developed countries also can have greater accountability to manage their own waste and not just dump their waste into less developed countries just because it's a cheaper option.
I would basically put it in a ban to make countries responsible for their own waste.
I mean, that seems fair to me. We are going to start to close out the episode, so I have two final questions for you. The first is there a piece of good news that has come out in your work recently that you can share with us?
Something positive is that Malaysia has been really pushing for sustainability initiatives, and they've also come up with a lot of funds to help companies really be greener and more sustainable. So that is definitely a positive thing that I can share here.
To go to Thailand, so Thailand has changed its law. Before it was quite strict. They couldn't use any recycled plastic bottles because the Food and Health Administration was quite worried about, because people use plastic bottles for oil, for example, to fill up cars and motorbikes. And so they were quite worried about the sanitary issue of this. But after quite a bit of lobbying by both private sectors, surprisingly, but also a civil society, they have changed that regulation. And so that will certainly improve recycling in Thailand.
Okay, great. That's good to hear. The last question is, did we miss anything today that we cannot forget to mention? Is there anything you'd like to add on the topic of global plastic waste or working in the sector of sustainability?
So one great thing is that I actually meet champions. Whereas one woman that I co-authored with named Sujitra, she's the champion of plastic reform in Thailand. And she's involved in so many different organizations, and she's trying to rewrite laws. But there are also NGOs, there's also startups, all trying to address this issue. So it's great to talk to those people. It gives me more hope, but also motivates me to report on this issue, to write about it, and to work with them. So that's one great part about my job, is to not only look at the bad side, but also see that people are trying to address this issue.
Well, then with that, I will say thank you so much for your time and for your important work in this space.
Thank you too for the interview.
Yeah, likewise, thank you for having me.
Okay, a major thank you to both Dr. Marks and Dr. Hui Ling. What to say about all of this? One thing that a lot of scientists have been telling me needs to happen with plastic is we need to stop production in a major way, especially of unnecessary plastic. The million-dollar question is, what's it going to take for that to happen? I guess the main reason it hasn't is because those who have the power to pressure companies and governments that are controlling the influx of plastic waste, and I say that because it's a collective thing, right? I'm included in that group. But we haven't been mobilized to put this pressure because we haven't had to face the consequences yet, or we don't know about them. The invisible consequences are too small for us to see, and the visible ones exist in the middle of the ocean or halfway around the world. But maybe that's false. Maybe we do know about the visible ones and we just don't care. I mean, China banned plastic imports in 2018, and Dr. Ling told us that Malaysia sent back our waste in 2019. So journalists have been reporting on this for over half a decade, and our production has only increased since then. But you know what? It seems like things might be about to change. And I hope that they do. I hope we do become accountable for the waste that we produce. Let's remember that statistic from the UK, sending away 70% of its waste. First of all, I want us to think about this whenever we see a news article about how waste in Southeast Asia is so improperly mismanaged. We need to be careful when we say these things because it can amount to a form of environmental scapegoating, which is what happens when we place blame and attention for environmental destruction on one isolated group while deflecting attention away from a system of destruction and often the root causes and most responsible actors. Now, this is a problem because it hinders our ability to address the root causes, and it can also result in a misplaced demonization. Second of all, I think that the West might be in for a big wake-up call. Imagine if the UK suddenly has to deal with over 3 times what it's already dealing with. The sad thing is, if I know capitalism like I think I do, we will just rely on the same systems of environmental injustice that we already see in the West, and they will only become worse, as our current systems will find a way to offload environmental consequences to groups that can't fight back. And I guess I'm going to end this episode on the very tippy top of my soapbox, but I do think it's important to say these things, and if you think so too, you are very welcome to send this episode to someone who might find it interesting and to help me spread the word. And with that, I will say thank you for listening. You've been listening to Plastic Podcast. You can find more information about this week's guests and links to their work in the episode description. Cover art for the show was done by Laurel Wong, and the music you're listening to was done by Tadeo Cabejos. I am your host, Clark Marchese, and this episode was produced, written, and engineered by me. Plastic Podcast is part of a larger network of sciencey podcasts called Pine Forest Media. You can find more information about us in the episode description or on our website at pineforestpods.com, on Instagram at pineforestmedia, and we are now on TikTok. So for all of those of you in the US, I would love to see you there for as long as you will be able to see me there. We've got some exciting science podcasts coming out, and giving this episode a 5-star rating across platforms and a review on Apple Podcasts is one of the best things you can do to help the entire network to grow. All right, thank you to all of you who have made it this far, and a very special thank you to Elena from Paris, who says, "This podcast is amazing. So well researched, features expert guests who are passionate to share their specialty, and best of all, the subtle comedy nods to queer culture by the host. A must listen." I actually don't think I had a single queer reference in this episode, so Elena from Paris, this one is just for you.
Please, these gays, they're trying to murder me.
If you would like your review to be featured on the show, all you've got to do is leave one on Apple Podcasts, and you'll probably get picked. All right, now finally for the answer to last week's trivia question. The answer was giraffes. Giraffes have the highest blood pressure. Okay, now that is actually all I have for you today, and we'll talk soon.